in the life of a designer. Make sure that you like, subscribe, make sure that you share this with your friends and family so that way they can tap in to the gems that we drop in here on on our Dreams of Ruler channel. So just to let y'all know, we're gonna be talking about the missing chapter in the American fashion world. You feel me? You know, we always open the question, but first, I also want to let you know that you guys need to go check out our From the Mud collection. It's available on our website, pretty much detailing, pain, struggle, pressure, and turning it into progress and success. You feel me? We also got the spoken word album available on all streaming platforms to give you the vibes. We also have, the poetry book available on all book platforms and at your local library. So make sure that you tap in, show love, keep visualizing your purpose. But let's get right into it. So we always open up with an opening question. And tonight's opening question is, what opportunities still exist between street fashion and luxury fashion? And why does Dreams of Ruler exist to explore it? The fashion gap, our philosophy isn't that street fashion needs validation from luxury. It's that there is still room for a fashion house that combines the cultural authenticity of the street with the discipline, craftsmanship, storytelling, and long-term thinking associated with luxury fashion. You know, the gap includes, several ideas. Street fashion has enormous, cultural influence, but few brands are built with, the long-term structure of a, fashion house. Luxury fashion has established, systems for craftsmanship, archives, and heritage, but often feels disconnect from the everyday experiences that shape, the life, street life, and street culture. Many brands, emphasize, seasonal drops, while fewer focus on creating an evolving body of work that people can follow over years. There's an opportunity to build a brand where every collection contributes to one larger narrative instead of, an existing isolated release or releases. You know, that is the chapter we're trying to type in the, overall book of Dreams of Rulers. Number one is why another clothing brand wasn't enough. You know what I'm saying? What really made me believe that, there was room for a different approach was, seeing brands like the Hundreds where, they have documentation of, their story, but they don't really have, full on documentaries or, they just have, certain books or certain lookbooks that, describe different moments that happen with the brand. Or, you know what I'm saying? You got brands like Stussy and Supreme where you see the footage of, them coming up, but, you don't really see the behind the scenes of everything that they did in order to get to where they, ended up being. Dreams of Rulers as a street fashion house, rather than just a simple clothing brand, you know, embodies everything as far as documentation of the behind the scenes of how we're building. Then on top of that, you know what I'm saying, giving you the story of where everything comes from, how we're building on top of that, and how we, continue to embody craftsmanship, embody, high quality products, embody, different things that can, ultimately make us a fashion house instead of, just a street fashion brand. Number two is, the space between, street fashion and luxury. Street fashion, embodies the identity, the culture, the community, and overall self-expression. Whereas, luxury just taps into craftsmanship, consistency, heritage, and enduring, the standards. The reason why I believe both of these consist goes into number three, where, building a fashion house instead of, chasing trends. You know, the goal is to create collected collections, you know, um, a recognizable design language and style, what I'm saying, that people can, recognize without a logo, an archive that grows over time. You feel me? Where, people can not like, don't like even just have to tap into, the products as far as the apparel, but they can tap into other things that associate with the brand that, push the philosophies forward. You know what I'm saying? The philosophies, that guide every release. Number four is, what does success look like? Instead of measuring success only by, sales, what most brands now do, we're looking at, have we built trust? Have we created work, people remember? Are we raising the standard we set for ourselves? And, are we contributing an impact that's going to raise the standards in the industry? You feel me? Overall, it's like, what do you think is still missing in fashion today? And honestly, back in the, 70s, 80s, 90s, fashion was more of a, space where people actually had their own individuality and their own, way of doing things. And they embodied, the the whole idea of being, original, whether it was being, more simplistic in, women's fashion, or, where Versace was, focused on, making bold prints and, using a wide color palette. It's just more so of, understanding that there's a space for creativity, but also there's also got to be more craftsmanship and, what we're doing as a culture. Can a brand stay rooted in street culture while pursuing luxury level standards? For sure. If you really think about it, Ralph Lauren just did that with his brand over, a solid period of time. First started out, from the street, he embodied, more of a luxury pathway, but it ended up getting to a standard of where, people look at it as a sense of luxury at a more affordable price. What makes, fashion house different from a clothing brand? So we pretty much touched on that, Joe. It's pretty much the consistency, what I'm saying? The idea of heritage, longevity, legacy, you feel me? Consistency, enduring, standards, having, a strong philosophy for your brand. That's ultimately what helps you to continue to grow, to help, build your fashion brand into another stratosphere of being more of a house than just a, label. Having connected collections, what I'm saying, a recognizable design language, an archive behind, every collection that you drop. That's ultimately, what makes the difference between a fashion house and a clothing brand. What kind of legacy should a modern street fashion house aim to leave? And honestly, so, the main goal is to set up a fashion house that leaves a lasting impact of legacy, what I'm saying, of meaning to, the audience, the community, the customers. And then from a street fashion side of things, embodying an identity, having a little bit of rebellion with the way that you do things as far as design, and also, just the overall culture of the brand. And then, as well, just building a strong community, building, a strong sense of self-expression within, your designs. Dreams of Rulers wasn't created because the world needed another logo or another drop. It was created because I believe there's still room for a fashion house that treats street fashion with the same intentionality, craftsmanship, and long-term vision that define great fashion houses. You feel me? While staying connected to, the culture, you know what I'm saying? Hip hop culture, skate culture, you know what I'm saying? Surf culture, everything that's made up, you know what I'm saying? Street fashion as a whole. But connecting, the culture and experiences that gave, street fashion its voice in the first place. So that's why, you see me designing certain things. That's why you see me, using abstract and surreal art instead of just, trying to throw up isolated imagery, graphics, typography on things, and giving it a full sense of, meaning and impact, and ultimately, culture. So you just got to understand how, you're developing your product, understand how you're designing, having a sense of, where you want to go with your brand, understanding your vision. So that way, when you set up, your plan, it has a clear sense of direction. That's why we ultimately have been talking about, designer's eye. That's why we've been talking about building a solid body of work. The difference between good design and great design. All these things, factor in, especially when, comes down to like editing your designs, having the power of restraint. All these things, are cohesive to being consistent and disciplined and focused on your vision as a designer, and ultimately as, a creative director as well too. So like I say, always come up with a solid plan, do the research, and execute that motherfucker to the fullest, and your dreams and goals will come to fruition. Keep visualizing. I'm out.